My favourite vintage fashion show is John Galliano's Autumn-Winter 1994 collection, which was presented in the Hotel Particular of the Portuguese socialite São Schlumberger. The collection that Galliano had shown before was called Princess Lucretia, which a lot of people have seen. It has enormous crinolines, and the models ran down the catwalk to the sound of wolves howling. It was creatively much acclaimed, but it left Galliano penniless, and his backers pulled out. So Anna Wintour of American Vogue took it upon herself to support someone that she saw as immensely talented. She sent Andre Leon Talley over with money to buy him food, and also introduced him to various bankers, including bankers of Payne Webber, who agreed to finance a show for him. But the agreement came through, I think, about 3 weeks before the autumn-winter collections. He'd already missed the previous autumn-winter season, and Anna said that he couldn't possibly miss this one because it would be detrimental to his career. So in February of 1994, he started to pull this show together. It was almost entirely made out of black fabric because it was the only thing that he could get his hands on at the time. And it ended up being 17 outfits. 2 were in pink. And what he did was approach kind of the world's greatest models who had all modelled for him before, people like Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, Kate Moss, Christy Turlington, who all agreed to model for love rather than for money, and maybe to get the clothes at the end of it. This show's so important, first of all, because it was incredibly fundamental for Galliano's career. It really kick-started him as not only a creative but a commercial force in Paris. It revived for the 90s the use of bias cutting, which is a 1920s technique of cutting cloth to hug the female body. It proved to be incredibly influential and was copied by everybody. It also triggered a trend amongst other Parisian designers to start showing their own collections away from the central Louvre showground, off the beaten track in odd venues. And really it brought Galliano to the attention of the French couture establishment. First of all, the clients who started to commission him to make these wonderful clothes for them, and then ultimately of people like Bernard Arnault of LVMH, who eventually handed him the reins first of Givenchy and then of Dior. The wonderful thing, I think, about the clothes in that collection is when you look at them, you couldn't pinpoint exactly when they were from. There's this amazing sort of historical melange or bricolage of different references. So there's 20s bias cutting, there are kimonos, there are trains, there is a sleeve which was based on pictures of Palestinian women making bread because they used to knot their sleeves at the back, but obviously John kind of expanded it into something very complicated that kind of crossbred it with an obi. It was really about this kind of return, especially after grunge, I think, this return of old school glamour, this idea of seams and stockings, groomed hair, real diamonds. Almost the whole collection was made in bias cut satin crepe, which is a two-sided fabric, and economically it meant that John could use both sides of the fabric and could contrast the matte and the shiny to create different effects. The bias cut dresses in that collection were extraordinary. First of all, because of the mastery of cut in them, and also, as I said, because of the influence they had over late 20th century fashion as a whole. They really became a symbol of what women wore at night in the 90s. And it completely stemmed from what he'd been doing. There were other pieces like Nadja Auermann wore a shearling jacket, which was based on one of John's old wolf jackets, and he'd gone to tea at the Ritz and decided to wear it upside down, which meant that it ended up with this enormous portrait collar, which of course had been the sort of tails of the jacket, which he threw backwards, which interestingly really links it back to his 80s work. You look at this and it's very sophisticated, very polished, whereas the 80s work was much rawer. But that was all about topsy-turvy experimentation, wearing clothes in unconventional ways to make the ordinary seem extraordinary. And also Kate Moss's kimono was wonderful, which was one of the few shots of pink in the collection. It was a very brief silk chiffon kimono, which was tied in a knot at the sleeves. And really, I think that image of Kate walking in that kimono kind of became emblematic of his career, of these fusions of Oriental and Occidental influences, which then carried through to his work both at Givenchy and at Dior and under his own label. It was really this kind of melting pot of different cultural influences that kind of epitomised his approach to fashion. I think imagining this show happening today is very interesting because it's very rare that you see somebody in those kind of dire straits. I often think there are so many different prizes and so many different bodies who now award money to young designers, and John wasn't even that young then. He'd been in the industry for 10 years. Today, I'm not sure anyone reaches that point, but at the same time, I've been told by people that worked on the collection that John phoned them up in London and was like, can you come to Paris, because people want to buy the clothes. They weren't geared up to sell anything. That wasn't what they were doing it for. They weren't doing it for they weren't even doing it for acclaim. They weren't doing it for money. They were doing it just for the love, and also kind of because they couldn't do anything else. It's the only way they could kind of express themselves. It was the only way to have those kind of ideas, and it was the only sort of platform for those kind of ideas. And certainly for what John was doing, he kind of only ever wanted to be a fashion designer. I think today maybe it's nice that no one would end up in that situation, but at the same time, I think the idea of someone having those restrictions and still being able to create something magical is incredibly beautiful. So maybe it would be nice if someone did end up in that position and did have to try and create something wonderful with next to nothing. But I really think it's one of those collections that stood the test of time. If you look at it today, and if you look at the clothes today, they're still incredibly desirable. They're immaculately made. And they have this odd sense of historicism and modernity. It's this kind of, I think a lot of people think of John Galliano as being a very historical designer, as being a costume designer. But you look at them and it's the thing that makes them modern is the cut and the construction. And they may have a kind of a delicacy that seems to belong to another time, but they're incredibly modern.
Well, it's quite inspired by glamour and the purity of the kimono, and at the same time 1940s tailoring, so I tried to make a fusion of the two. I like the challenge of the clothes being seen close up. A lot of it was cut on the bias, as you know. Glamour.